And now I'm going to be reading from the Rig Veda. Anuvaka 1, Sukta 11. The deity is Agni, the rishi is Havirdana Agni, the meter is Jagati, except for the first 6 verses. The meter is Jagati for the first 6 verses, and Trishtub for the rest. The great, the unconquerable Agni, the shower, milks openly with the great milking the streams of prosperity from heaven for the unwearying sacrificer. Like Varuna, he knows everything by his understanding. May he who is skilled in sacrifice observe the sacrificial seasons. The Gandharvi and the water-consecrated feminine oblation praise Agni. May he be favorable to the thought of me, raising my voice in his praise. May Agni place us in the midst of the sacrifice. The chief of the worshippers, our elder brother, repeats his various laudations. That very auspicious, resounding, famous dawn ascends, bringing the sun to man, when for the sacrifice, after the worship, they give birth to that Agni, the desirer, the invoker of the desiring gods. The hawk sent by Agni to the sacrifice has brought the dripping, copious, all-seeing Soma libation. When the Arya people chose the victorious Agni as the ministrant priest, then the sacred rite is celebrated. Thou, Agni, art everywhere pleasing to thy worshippers. As pasture satisfies the herds, be well worshipped with man's sacrifice. If commending the praise of the wise and partaking of the sacrificial food, thou connect with many divinities to the right. I'll read that again. Thou, Agni, art ever pleasing to thy worshippers, as pasture satisfies the herds. Be well worshipped with man's sacrifices. If commending the praise of the wise and partaking of the sacrificial food, thou comest with many divinities to the right. Wake up the parents, as the sun his splendor. The worshipper desires to offer worship to the deities who are pleased by it. With all his heart he wishes to do so. He desires to repeat thy praise. The bearer of the oblation is anxious to effect the good work. The sacrifice longs for augmentation. The prudent sacrificer trembles in his thoughts. Agni, son of strength, the mortal who obtains thy favor is widely celebrated, possessing abundant food and being conveyed by horses. Illustrious and vigorous, he graces the days of his existence. When, adorable Agni, this united praise is resplendent amongst the adorable gods, and when thou, bearer of the oblation, supportest the precious treasures, then allot to us a valuable share. Agni, present in the dwelling common to the deities, hear us. Harness thy swift chariot of ambrosia. Bring to us the heaven and earth, the daughters of the divine Prajapati. Let none of the gods be absent, and do thou thyself be present. Anuvaka, this again is continuing with the 10th mandala, Anuvaka 1, Sukta 12. The deity and rishi is before, which we'll remember the deity is Agni, and the rishi is Havirdana Agni. The meter is Trishtu. Heaven and earth, declarers of truth, principle of things, be present at the invocation, associated with the rite, when the divine Agni, exciting mortals to sacrifice, sits down in their presence, as the invoker of the gods putting forth his flame. Do thou, bright Agni, surrounding the gods, carry our oblation with due rites. Thou who art the chief of the deities, the wise, the smoke-bannered, fuel-kindled, straight-flaming, adorable, the invoker, the constant sacrificer with prayer. When the self-aggregated ambrosia of the divine Agni is generated from his radiance, then the products from it sustain both heaven and earth. All the worshippers glorify this thy oblation, the celestial nutritious water which thy white luster milks forth. I worship you, waters that pour forth ghee, and you, heaven and earth, for your increase. Hear me, ye worlds, when worshippers at the daily or nightly rite proceed to their pious purpose. Then may the parents of all sanctify us with ambrosia. But will the royal Agni accept our oblations? Have we duly performed our vows to him? Who decides, as a friend affectionately invited, so let our praise now proceed to the gods, together with the sacrificial food that is left over. Hard to understand is the nature of the immortal, for although of one origin she is of a different form. Cherish him diligently, great Agni, who understands Yama's nature, easy to be understood. In him the gods find pleasure at the sacrifice. They seat themselves on the altar of the sacrificer. They place light in the sun, beams in the moon, and these untiring shed their light around. When he, the all-illumining, is there, the gods assemble, but when he is concealed, we know not his abode. So at this sacrifice let Mitra and Aditi and Savitri proclaim us to Varuna as free from sin. Agni, present in the dwelling common to the deities, hear us. Harness thy swift chariot of ambrosia. Bring unto us the heaven and earth, the daughter of the divine Prajapati. Let none of the gods be absent, and do thou thyself be present. Sukta 13. The deities are the two shakatas. Small carts or barrows used at the sacrifices to carry the materials, especially the soma plant, hence called Havirdanas, oblation bearers. The rishi is Vivaswat, the son of Aditi. The meter is Trishtup, except in the last verse, in which it is Jagati. I load you too with sacred offerings, repeating an ancient prayer. May the sound of your approach reach the gods, like the path of the worshipper. May all the sons of the immortal Prajapati who inhabit the celestial regions hear the sound. When you two came, the twins busily engaged. Then devout worshippers brought you forward, knowing your place there abide, and be fair storehouses for our soma. I made the 5 stages of the sacrifice ascend. I take 4 steps by pious observances. With the sacred syllable I perfect this adoration. I purify the soma on the navel of the sacrifice. I'll say that again. I make the 5 stages of the sacrifice ascend. I take 4 steps by pious observances. With the sacred syllable I perfect this adoration. I purify the soma on the navel of the sacrifice. Whom has he selected as the slayer of the gods? Whom has he not selected as non-slayer of the human race? They have made the rishi Brihaspati the sacrifice. Yama preserves our loved bodies. The 7 meters offer laudation to the glorious, the adorable parent, the soma. His sons, the priests, utter his true praise. You both are lords of both men and gods. You both exert yourselves and are the nourishers of both men and gods. Anuvaka 1, Sukta 14. The rishi is Yama, the son of Vivaswat. The deity is Yama, except verse 6, the Lingokta deities. Verses 7 to 9, the Lingokta deities are the Petris, and verses 10 to 12, the 2 dogs, sons of Sharama. The meter of the first 12 verses is Trishtup, of the 13th, 14th, and 16th Anushtup, and of the 15th Brihati. Worship with oblations Yama, king of the Petris, son of Vivaswat, the aggregation of mankind, who conducts those who are virtuous over the earth, and opens to many the path of heaven. Yama, the chief of all, knows our well-being. This pasture no one can take from us. By the road by which our forefathers have gone, all who are born proceed along the paths they have made for themselves. Matalin prospers with the Kavyas, Yama with the Angirasas, Brihaspati with the Rikvans. They whom the gods augment, and they who augment the gods, these rejoice in Swaha, those in the Swadha. Yama, who art associated with the Angirasa Petris, sit down at this sacrifice. May the prayers recited by the priests bring thee hither. Be exhilarated, sovereign Yama, by this oblation. Come hither, Yama, with the venerable multiform Angirasas, and be exhilarated. I summon Vivaswat, who is thy father, to this sacrifice. May he, seated on the sacrifice, on the sacred grass, delight the sacrificer. The Angirasas, the Atharvas, the Brigus, who are entitled to the Soma, are our recent progenitors. May we ever have a place in the favor of these venerable Petris. May we be ever held in their auspicious regard. Depart, depart by the former paths by which our forefathers have departed. There shalt thou behold the two monarchs, Yama and the divine Varuna, rejoicing in the Swadha. Be united with the Petris with Yama, and with the fulfillment of thy wishes in the highest heaven. Discarding iniquity, return to thine abode, and unite thyself to a luminous body. Depart from hence, be gone, go far off, evil spirits. The Petris have assigned this place to him. Yama has given him a place of cremation, consecrated by days, streams, and nights. Pass by a secure path beyond the two-spotted, four-eyed dogs, the progeny of Sarama, and join the wise Petris who rejoice joyfully with Yama. Entrust him, O king, to thy two dogs, which are thy protectors, Yama, the four-eyed guardians of the road, renowned by men, and grant him prosperity and health. The messengers of Yama, broad-nosed and of exceeding strength, and satiating themselves with the life of mortals, hunt mankind. May they allow us this day a prosperous existence here, that we may look upon the sun. Pour out the soma for Yama. To Yama offer the oblation. The decorated sacrifice, of which Agni is the messenger, proceeds to Yama. Offer the oblation of clarified butter to Yama, and stand nigh to the altar. It is he who among the gods gives us a long life to live. Offer to the royal Yama this most sweet oblation. Let this our adoration be addressed to the ancient sages, the first followers of virtuous paths. Yama acquires the three Trikadruka sacrifices, the 6 earths, the one great moving world, the Trishtup, Gayatri, all the sacred meters converge in Yama. And now I'm going to go on and read something that I got yesterday, an email that was quite shocking to me. And as I read it, what you're looking at is a cross, a stone cross that was given to me by a saint in the south of India who later became my master. I don't know if he still considers me his master because I pretty much failed Yantra 101. While I was at the ashram, I couldn't understand really why I was encouraged to stay there, because it wasn't such an enjoyable experience, although when my finances changed back home, it seemed as though there wasn't much for me to come back to either. And what's behind the cross is a book that has really captured my attention, and I checked it out from the library. It's Modern Psychoanalysis of the Schizophrenic Patient by a great psychiatrist in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Hyman Spotnitz developed a technique that was able to take patients that Sigmund Freud considered incurable and start to treat them by making a profoundly important contribution to the psychoanalytic literature. And I found it interesting that this book is an enduring memorial to the men, women, and children whose lives were lost in the tragic events of September 11th, 2001. Support has been provided generously by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So in many ways, a consideration of what is crazy and what is sane was really started for me when I came back from India and got a DVD in my mailbox that showed a close-up depiction of how the towers came down. So let me read now this very shocking email. I don't even know if shocking is the word. It comes from a lady, I believe, who's in Germany, and the subject is German POWs and their destiny after all the guns of World War II fell silent. Half of the German POWs in the West were imprisoned by the U.S. forces, half by the British. The number of prisoners reached such a huge proportion that the British could not accept any more, and the U.S. consequently established the Rheinwiesen from April to September of 1945, where they quickly built a series of cages in open meadows and enclosed them with razor wire. One such notorious field was located at Bad Kreuznach, where the German prisoners were herded into open spaces with no toilets, tents, or shelters. They had to burrow sleeping spaces into the ground with their bare hands, and in some there was barely enough room to lay down. In the Bad Kreuznach cage, up to 560,000 men were interned in a congested area and denied adequate food, water, shelter, or sanitary facilities, and they died like flies of disease, exposure, and illness after surviving on less than 700 calories a day. There are 1,000 official graves in Bad Kreuznach, but it is claimed that there are mass graves which have remained off limits to investigation. Incidentally, the investigation of graves might be considered to fall under the auspices of agori, there are spiritual practices that are done in graveyards. It's considered the left-hand path, not because it harms anyone, but because it has methodologies that regular society is not comfortable with. And so the study of burial grounds is also an important part of investigation to bring exhibits before in court trials. So I find it interesting that these graves remain off limits. They also have the purported graves, mass graves at the concentration camps of the Holocaust. You know, the purported Jewish Holocaust. These are off limits also. So what's purported and what's true and what isn't a lot could come to light if you would just study these graves, even though it's gross. So I'm going to go on and we'll see that not studying that which is unpleasant leads to things that are worse. Again, why I'm so interested in modern psychoanalysis of the schizophrenic patient, because Hyman Spotnitz was able to go into the aggressive drive of Sigmund Freud, the Thanatos drive, that even some Freudians aren't even comfortable with. But he was able to use it in a curative way by showing that the schizophrenic patient was taking this drive, and in order to protect the world that it loved and felt that it needed, it would turn this drive in on its own mind. The schizophrenic will destroy its own mind. So let me go on with this email, and you'll see why the world can be very maddening and why a person might be driven to a fragile mental condition. There were no impartial observers to witness the treatment of POWs held by the U.S. Army from the date Germany unconditionally surrendered, May 8, 1945. Switzerland was dismissed as the official protecting power for German prisoners, and the International Red Cross was informed that, with no protecting power to report to, there was no need for them to send delegates to the camps. In 1945, thousands of German POWs were jammed into U.S. Army vehicles, going through towns such as Nuremberg and Emskirchen below. I guess I'll talk about it later. They often traveled for hundreds of miles without being able to sit and with no food, rest, or relief stops. Hundreds of German prisoners were confined in makeshift U.S. camps in Emskirchen and elsewhere. Some were sent to fields, mud holes, quarries, and hell holes elsewhere. It is very tricky giving numbers since most records are absent or inaccurate. Only by the autumn of 1945, after most camps had closed or were in the process of closing, was the Red Cross granted permission to send delegates to visit camps. In the French and UK occupation zones, and to finally provide minuscule amounts of relief. And it was not until February 4th, 1946, that the Red Cross was allowed to send even token relief to others in the U.S.-run occupation zone. The death rate for prisoners in these U.S. camps was at that point 30% per year, according to a U.S. medical survey. Nearly all the surviving records of the Rhineland death camps were destroyed. But these men were lucky. Large numbers of captured soldiers were taken away to be enslaved. If captured in smaller groups, even the U.S. Army policy was to slaughter the prisoners where they stood, especially if they were SS. The largest currently acknowledged massacres at the hands of the Americans were the murder of 700 troops of the surrendered 8th SS Mountain Division, atrocities carried out against the surrendered SS Westphalia Brigade, where most of the German captives were shot through the back of the head, and the machine gunning of 300 surrendered camp guards at Dachau. Over 1,000 captured SS officers were also poisoned by eating arsenic-laced bread in 1946 in an American camp near Nuremberg. Ingrid's note: I am not sure this is true. I know there was such a plan. Some Jews bragged about it on TV some years ago, but I never heard that it was carried out. That's a note put in by the person that sent this to me. There was also an alleged mass murder of as many as 48 surrendered German prisoners who were captured on April 15, 1945, at Jungholzhausen. An eyewitness stated, "The Americans forced the Germans to walk in front of them with raised hands in groups of 4. Then they shot the prisoners in their heads from behind. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and taken away. The matter is still under investigation." At the end of June 1945, the first camps in Remagen, Bol-Ingelheim, and Buderich were dissolved. SHAEF offered the camps to the French, who wanted 1.75 million prisoners of war to use as slave labor. In July, Sinzig, Adenach, Sierschein, Bretzheim, Diedersheim, Koblenz, Hechtsheim, and Dietz, all containing thousands of prisoners, were given to France. In the British zone, prisoners of war who were able to work were transferred to France, and the rest were released. At the end of September 1945, all the initial camps were dissolved. At one point, 80,000 prisoners of war a month were supposed to have been returned from USA captivity and discharged into the Allied zones of Germany as part of the 1.3 million allotted to France for, quote, rehabilitation work, in parentheses, slave labor. But after the Red Cross reported that 200,000 of the prisoners already in French hands were so undernourished they were unfit for labor and likely to die over the winter, the USA stopped all transfer of prisoners to French custody until the French would maintain them in accordance with the Geneva Convention. About 250,000 Germans, including most of the Afrika Korps, KORPS, and Italians surrendered in Tunis in May 1943 and were taken as prisoners of war, where they sweltered in large pens in the desert heat. Many survivors were later sent to Egypt and camps in the U.S. and elsewhere. By the winter of 1947, it was estimated that 4,160,000 German POWs were still held in work camps outside of Germany, 750,000 in France, 30,000 in 160,000 German POWs were still held in work camps outside of Germany, 750,000 in France, 30,000 in Italy, 460,000 in Britain, 14,000 in Belgium at one point 48,000, 4,000 in Luxembourg, and 1,300 in Holland. As discussed later, the Soviet Union started with 4 million to 5 million. Yugoslavia had 80,000, and Czechoslovakia 45,000, as well as the USA's 140,000 in the U.S. occupation zone, with 100,000 more later also held in France. It is estimated that 700,000 to 1 million men may have died within the period they spent incarcerated in American and French camps alone from 1945 to 1948. There are much higher estimates, however, and attempts to uncover the truth regarding these camps in modern times, as well as excavation of reported mass grave sites, have been vigilantly thwarted by, among others, the German government. It is unknown how many perished under British captors, but recently declassified documents indicate widespread torture and abuse. Under all of them, many of the prisoners were used to do dangerous work, such as working with hazardous materials and mine-sweeping in complete disregard of the law. Nearly all the surviving records of the Rhineland death camps were destroyed. Although it was always strongly denied, Morgenthau himself said his plan was implemented. In the New York Post for November 24, 1947, he wrote, "The Morgenthau Plan for Germany became part of the Potsdam Agreement, a solemn declaration of policy and undertaking for action, signed by the United States of America, Great Britain, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics." So I'll find out what that Morgenthau Plan is. I don't know what it is as of this time. After the German capitulation in Norway on May 8, 1945, over 5,000 German prisoners of war were forced by the British under the command of General Sir Andrew Thorne to undertake clearance of landmines in clear violation of the Geneva Convention of 1928. The POWs had to walk arm in arm through minefields already cleared of mines in hopes of triggering off landmines that were not found previously. This act of cruelty led to the deaths of 184 German soldiers and the injuring of another 252 POWs. Neither Thorne nor anyone else was ever held accountable for war crimes. It happened in Denmark as well, and a Danish historian documented the killing of German POWs during such clearance of landmines. It is assumed that about 250 German POWs met their deaths in this way, in Denmark when forced to perform this diabolical task. On the morning of July 22, 1945, 7 Germans were blown into the air as 450 landmines detonated. The other German POWs had to then collect the body parts of their friends without using gloves or other protection. In the communist realms, the condition that German POWs, many just kids, endured on the Eastern Front were beyond grim, and did not follow any accepted protocol for treatment of captured soldiers. Under the provisions of the Yalta Agreement, the US and UK had agreed to the use of German POWs in the Soviet Gulag as reparations in kind, unquote. But comparatively few Germans were taken alive before Stalingrad. Most were shot and many were mutilated alive. Of the 90,000 Germans who marched into Soviet captivity at Stalingrad, only 5,000 ever returned. 40,000 did not survive the march to the Bekatovka camp, where another 42,000 perished of hunger and disease. Those POWs that made it alive to separate camps in Siberia and elsewhere in the Western Soviet Union were forced into slave labor and endured frequent beatings, brutal torture, poisonings, and execution. The Gulag's daily food ration was padded with 400 to 800 grams of bread. More than half of the prisoners daily, 1,200 to 1,300 calories. The most productive workers received a modest food bonus. Ironically, the Morgenthau Plan for occupied Germany suggested the same allotment of 1,300 calories a day per German, while the suggested minimum requirement for heavy labor are from 3,100 to 4,000 calories per day. In the gulags, the prisoner's food ration was linked to his production, realizing that the most productive work done by prisoners is in the first 3 months of captivity, after which they were too debilitated to perform well. The exhausted prisoners were simply killed off and replaced with fresh blood, ensuring a constant flow of new labor. Because the German POWs had been conveniently redefined as, quote, unquote, disarmed enemy forces, Allied captors did whatever they wanted with their German captives, even bartering them away to others for use as slaves. In fact, in a re-education, quote-unquote, bulletin distributed by the Soviet Special Services Division, Army Services Forces of the U.S. Army in 1945, tacit approval is given for the intentional transfer of German POWs from Allied hands to the genocidal Red Army. Many German prisoners will remain in Russia after the end of the war, not voluntarily, but because the Russians need them as workers. That is not only perfectly legal, but also prevents the danger of the returning prisoners of war becoming the core of a new national movement. If we ourselves do not want to keep the German prisoners after the war, we should send them nonetheless to Russia. That's a quote. Again, Shades of Morgenthau. I don't know if that quote's from Morgenthau. It says Shades of Morgenthau, so I have to learn what Morgenthau was about. Continuing, long columns of German soldiers were marched on foot hundreds of torturous miles towards their doom in Stalingrad, Kiev, Kharkov, Moscow, and Minsk, where most were starved and worked to death. Very few ever saw home again. When approximately 6,000 German officers were released by the Western Allies in the first half of 1945, they were then rearrested by the Soviets and held in Zone 2 at Sachsenhausen prison camp, which had formerly held the communist political prisoners of the Nazis. Later, Special Camp No. 7 was filled with German prisoners who had been sentenced by a Soviet military tribunal to 15 years of hard labor. By the end of 1945, it held 12,000 to 16,000 prisoners, among them 2,000 female prisoners, but the population grew. I don't know what that means. The population grew because they had children with the female prisoners? Inquiring minds want to know. There was inadequate food and deplorable sanitary conditions. Prisoners could have no clothing other than what they were wearing when arrested. This is so discouraging. I have to make it larger because my eyesight is so the only clothes they had was what they were wearing when they were arrested. Disease and epidemics ran through the barracks where the prisoners had to sleep on the bare wood frames, and only a block of wood for a pillow for 2 years, until blankets and bags of straw were finally distributed in 1947. They were not allowed any activities, and even singing was prohibited. The windows of the overcrowded barracks were blacked out, and prisoners were kept in almost total darkness. A total of approximately 60,000 German prisoners were held in Special Camp No. 7 after World War II ended, and 12,000 were buried in unmarked mass graves. None were released by the Soviets until 1948, and most prisoners remained there until 1950, and some were sent on to the Soviet gulags or handed over to the East German Communist government for even more punishment. The fates of thousands, and keep in mind, I was always a great fan of Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication. He always stressed that even in our individual communication, we need to learn skills where punishment is not involved, because punishment never works. And today, here in America, our only two growing industries are healthcare and prisons, which is all about government. And so I ask you, with a robust industry of prisons, can we really say that punishment works? Is our society working right now with the foreclosures, mortgage defaults, and so on? It's like fueled on by prisons. Okay, and incidentally, what will send you to prison is the cure for cancer. Look at the research going on with cannabis, and the patent that I put forward in another show that was given to the U.S. government by 3 scientists, one of whom is a Nobel Prize winner. So why would scientists who could make money at this give away a patent unless they feel that the whole paradigm that involves money is wrong? So they're walking away from riches by doing that. But so to go on with this grisly account, but an account that I think we need to face and incorporate before we can be successful at coming up with more successful strategies. The fates of thousands upon thousands of German soldiers, many just kids, surrendered to both the Allies and especially the Soviets, have never been accounted for, and any attempts to uncover the truth of their disappearance have been halted. Between 1941 and 1952, millions of German POWs died in the Gulag. The last surviving 10,000 of them were not released from the Soviet Union until 1955, after a decade of forced labor. About 1.5 million Germans are still listed as missing in action and join the ranks of those who vanished while under Soviet captivity. In total, 5,025 German men and women were convicted of war crimes between 1945 and 1949 in the American, British, and French zones by Allied war crimes trials. Over 500 were sentenced to death, and the majority were executed, among them 21 women. The Red Terror was let loose on surrendered German POWs in Eastern Europe, from Czechoslovakia to Poland and beyond. Many were simply shot and thrown into mass graves. Others were tortured and mutilated first, and these retributions extended even to young boys. German POWs who fell into the hands of the Yugoslav hordes suffered horrible fates. After 1986, a report appeared showing that out of about 194,000 prisoners, up to 100,000 died from gruesome torture, murder, horrible conditions, disease, and intentional starvation. Around 93,000 ethnic Germans who lived in the Danube Basin from 1939 to 1941 served in Hungarian, Croatian, and Romanian armies, and these remained citizens of those countries during the war. Many of these ethnic Germans served in the Prinz Eugen-Waffen SS division of about 10,000, which automatically gave them German citizenship. 26,000 of these soldiers died, over half after the end of the war, in Yugoslav camps, when most of the Eugen, E-U-G-E-N, Division surrendered after May 8, 1945. Over 1,700 of them were murdered in a village near the Croat-Slovenia border, and the other half was worked to death in Yugoslav zinc mines near the town of Bor in Serbia. Aside from these Danube's German soldiers, over 70,000 Germans who had served in regular Wehrmacht died in Yugoslav captivity from revenge murders or as slave laborers in dangerous work. These were mostly troops of Army E who surrendered to the British in southern Austria on May 8, 1945, only to have the British turn about 150,000 of them over to vengeance-fueled communist Yugoslav partisans who dealt with them as brutally as they could. Mob surrounds POW left locations unknown. The fates of the remaining captured German troops in Yugoslavia was murder, both fast and slow. The fates of the remaining captured German troops in Yugoslavia was murder, both fast and slow. The fates, she repeated that twice. First, up to 10,000 died in communist organized atonement marches, in quotes. Surin March. Sune March, which stretched 800 miles from the southern border of Austria to the northern border of Greece. In most instances, the prisoners were all tied together and forced to walk barefoot with no food or water. As some dropped off one by one on these death marches, others were executed or tied together in smaller groups and thrown into rivers, where they were all shot for sport and drowned. On November 1, 1944, the Council for the Liberation of Yugoslavia declared all Germans open prey, and less than half the German POWs in ethnic German civilizations survived the partisans' genocide during this time. Then later in the summer of 1945, many more German POWs were murdered in mass executions or thrown alive into large karst pits, K-A-R-S-T, pits, along the Dalmatian coast of Croatia. For the next 10 years, from 1945 to 1955, as was the case in the Soviet Union and other communist countries, 50,000 more German prisoners died from being worked to death as slaves and from the results of, and then there's just a missing chunk, from the results of thousands of Germans and Croat soldiers captured in the final days of the war were coldly executed and buried in mass graves found in western Croatia. A site recently uncovered at Harmika, 50 kilometers northwest of Zagreb, holds the bodies of 4,500 soldiers, including 450 German officers executed by the communist partisans. The bones of Harmika were found in 6 separate caves and laid in trenches upon discovery. The soldiers were buried in a separate grave. The officers were buried in a separate grave, presumably because they were separated from the soldiers and executed last. The victims were troops of the 392 Infantry Division, set up by the German command in Croatia in August 1943, and placed under the leadership of Lieutenant General Hans Mikl. The fates of thousands upon thousands of German soldiers, many just kids, surrendered to both the Allies and especially the Soviets, have never been accounted for, and any attempts to uncover the truth of their disappearance have been halted. An interesting footnote. After the war, many German combat veterans joined the French Foreign Legion. Some were surviving SS members recruited directly from prisoners of war camps. Others were men from lost German lands who had nowhere to go home to. Highly regarded by the French for their discipline and bravery, an estimated 35,000 Germans took part in France's war in Vietnam. Germans made up over half the Foreign Legion units in Vietnam that bore much of the heaviest fighting against the communist Viet Minh forces of Ho Chi Minh. In this brutal conflict, more than 10,000 legionnaires were killed out of about 70,000 who fought. Now, no matter what you might think about the Vietnam War, obviously no war is something pleasant to think about. There is a code of honor in war, and that's something that I'm dealing with when I'm reading from the Vedas, because when you start throwing out traditional codes of conduct, not taking into account the fact that war is a phenomenon in society, then with no code of conduct of how you behave in war so that the war can proceed in a way that's as, I don't know, for lack of a better word, as tidy and as correct as possible, so that you can get beyond the war and you can get on track with the society functioning again, having vented out its war, then you get a real disaster. It's like endless. You keep repressing the thanatos or the death drive, and it keeps popping up anyway in more insidious and even worse forms. So the point that I'm making is that we need to understand fully what our nature is, and there is a science to the unfolding of consciousness. And if the talking cure can release deep feelings, even those who think it's negative to talk about negative things, far better that we talk about it and face it so that we don't act on it in the way that I've just indicated has been acted upon in our past. As Harold Channer says, history's a nightmare from which I'm trying to awaken. Anyway, so that's where I was reading all of this. And I must say, I got to take a break, so I am going to decharge a little bit because there's a whole art to sacrifice, including finding out about this grisly information. That's a radioactive stone, and I put scalding water. Now it's warm, so in a couple hours the radioactivity can penetrate the water. So here I am charging up my plant in the radioactive water after I took my bath, and I think it gives good results. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up this show talking about this book that was sent to me by the publisher of, it's called Trine Day, and they're out of Walterville, Oregon. It's a book by Nick Bryant, and it's about pedophilia. A pedophilia scandal that took place in Omaha, Nebraska, and the subsequent cover-up. He worked for years putting this book together. And when I first talked to him on the telephone, I told him, you know, it's such a bleak topic, and I try to put before my viewers information that I feel they can work with, not that's just so overwhelming that they don't know exactly how to strike out. So I started this show with some I felt very powerful and moving readings from the Rig Veda. And it was talking about Agni being the youngest of the gods, so it talks about many gods. There is a big misunderstanding about what it means to view divinity in diversity as opposed to viewing divinity as unity. But you'll see that even in the Old Testament, when you talk about God, it's Elohim, which is plural, so there's a plural word. John West was somebody who had an understanding of Egyptian principles, like we'd say, oh, how pagan and strange the Egyptians were. Look at what they put up on the walls, all of these strange animals and strange creatures that they were worshipping. Well, John West, who is the star from Mystery of the Sphinx that got an award, got an Emmy Award for research, I think in 1993, talking about the water erosion on the Sphinx being much older than what we thought. So he said that what they're depicting on the walls in ancient Egypt are principles of nature. So what you want to do when you are wanting to be successful in the field of manifestation is invoke those principles that then you harmonize in your own life, and it makes you successful. So the whole art of sacrifice can also be called the art of prayer. How do you learn how to call upon that energy that you need in order to achieve a result that you're looking for? Now, I told him that I asked if he knew who DeAndre was. He didn't know anything about public access here in Manhattan. And I said, look at what's happened is she was a woman whose child was pedophiled by her husband, by her soon-to-be ex-husband. And because he was politically connected, he was a New York detective, she was the one that went to jail for 3 years, not him. The child was put into custody, into child care for 5 years. And then at the end of 5 years was returned to the husband. Now I kept sensing as I was working with DeAndrea, you have to get to a point of forgiveness, so you have to be able to empathize with all the parties. She was convinced that a pedophile could never be rehabilitated. I feel that we must never think never, and that is really what is the power of effective spiritual knowledge. It should be something that you can call into your life to bring about the changes that you want. So I said, look what's happened with this bleak topic that's so overwhelming. Dean Lauren, who used to work with DeAndrea, and DeAndrea aren't even talking anymore. And they were involved with something that I feel they should come forward, both of them, and get on the right side of things, because the right side of things, I feel, is where there's love and forgiveness for all parties, absolutely everyone. And I think that's what Marshall Rosenberg was getting at when he developed his principles of nonviolent communication, that punishment never works. Well, I told him I would read the book. I didn't think it would do much good to bring him on my show. I said, you know, what's one public access show going to do? But I must say, by the end, I was really, really heartened, because the protagonist, Alicia Owen, who talked about her pedophilia abuses, unlike the other people who came forward to talk about it, she never recanted it. And so the state of Nebraska eventually got her for perjury. But on so many accounts, it could have been a mistrial, and it should have been a mistrial. She was persistent, and I was very struck by how she was able to accomplish things that people thought were unaccomplishable, that you couldn't beat the system. She apparently, after being in solitary confinement for 400 days, and had to go back to jail because she lost a case that she shouldn't have lost. She was the only one brave enough to stand up about this. When she was in prison after the big trial, there was some point where she got down on her knees on the cement floor and she asked God to cut me some slack. I did the right thing and told the truth, and I couldn't seem to catch a break. I started to apply to colleges, and if I was given a full ride scholarship, I felt that would be a sign, and I do whatever it takes to go to college. I knew that I was supposed to fight. I also started researching the criteria for a bail bond. Nebraska law reads that you're allowed an appeal bond unless you're convicted of a capital offense, or you're going to be an extreme flight risk or danger to the public. Well, anyway, the point is she pulled it off. But the bigger point is that it was involved with the sacrifice. There's a certain humbling to get down on your knees on the cement floor and to pray. And in the Rig Veda, when I was reading, because I'm always talking about, was Jesus in India? Was Jesus exposed to this knowledge? Because today you've got like the Rig Veda and Hinduism in this court, and you've got Christianity and, oh, I'm only going to release all my stress in Jesus in that court, and you're not seeing that there's a similarity. So what was said was that the prudent sacrificer trembles in his thoughts. So he's embarking on something. He's calling forth the energies, but when the energies start coming, it has to be something that you merit. It has to be something that you can keep up, because it also, has a part about the relentless sacrificer, or somebody, the unwearying sacrificer. So that's the point. So if prayer should be something that we do unwearyingly, let's look on the art of sacrifice, which in India is called the path of Shakti, or it's the pursuit of power, because ultimately, when you're sacrificing, you're looking for some objective. But and so ultimately, you're going to be looking for power. So I think the discussions that Harold Channer and I have about whether abundance and giving people the ability to be more relaxed is going to solve things. I think it's how do you enjoy your power and your wealth? What do you do with it? And how can you connect to wealth in such a way that it's something that is productive and constructive for you and therefore will be for others. So the point is that you sacrifice for power. You're looking for power. Power needn't be considered something that is unspiritual. You need it because you want to love. You want to love with the power of God. And so I want to say I'm looking forward to working with Nick Bryant and hopefully connecting with more of the heroes that were involved in this case, because I think it's a bright point and it's something that we can all get behind and realize that if you can take corruption on that level and turn it around, what can't you turn around? I'm going to finish up with the Rig Veda again. That part that I read about Yama, Yama is the god of death. And so this talks about how the meter all converges. So how you get so that the knowledge that we need has to go beyond what we think of as successful in only this world. Here it is. The great, the unconquerable Agni, the shower, milks openly with the great milking the streams of prosperity from heaven for the unwearying sacrificer. And so what I'm proposing is that Alicia Owen was unwearying on the soul level. Her personality probably wouldn't have called upon all the adventures that she had and the abuses and the difficulties. The sacrificer longs for augmentation. The prudent sacrificer trembles in his thoughts. So our personality will often tremble, but our soul knows that the power is there if we can access it. And that's why it's important, I think, to develop a spiritual practice. And I do see psychoanalysis as a spiritual practice. Or as Lucy Holmes said, there can be no greater act of love than listening to another person. For myself, my practice is counting mantras. It's a spiritual practice. And finding out how I failed, Yantra 101, by studying this yantra, the swastika, which I placed with my father's x-rays to try to understand why my dad got bone cancer, why it degenerated and drifted away after he took this medication supposedly for